Chapter 4, the world of words, which I always want to say the war on words. Anyway, this whole chapter is about language. And even though I said that I'm going to skim through this one, I really do like it because every time I start to develop it and work on it, I learn more and more about language and how language is used, which is what I think is so important with interpersonal communication. Knowing how we say words has a very positive and strong effect on our interpersonal skills. So one thing that we're going to discuss is language and break that down. So we know that symbols are a part of language. Those are the words. Because if remember last, I guess a couple nights ago, I discussed that words on themselves are just words. It's us humans that attach the meanings to the word. And going back to that example about the fat. That girl is fat. What? No, she's cool, not really fat. Right? So the first thing that we need to know is that symbols are arbitrarity. So they may not even represent what they mean. They're ambiguity because they're not clear cut and they're abstract. They're not tangible. So just knowing those three things of what language is means that it's us, the humans, the sender. Go back to that communication model, the transactional one where the sender receives the message. It's us who attaches meaning along with these words. And we're the ones who say them. It's the way that we say them. Think about when we talk about language as rule governed. Think about also where we put those commas. Where do we put those periods? Where do we put those question marks and those, and those exclamation points? When we're writing something, we want people to know exactly where we stand on certain issues. And so we add those in. It's the same thing with language and the rule governance. So those are the three things about symbols that we have to know. So going into that, knowing that up front, we can already tell that we're going to have lots of miscommunications. Why? Because language is abstract. And it's different meanings for different words and people attach them. So we have to learn to be clear cut and we also have to understand how we choose to use language. I had this exact conversation with a coworker just the other day about how certain people use words and language and if everyone just said exactly what they meant and were careful about what they said and how they phrased emails, communication would be much better. So those are the first three things. One thing that I also want to touch on in this chapter is about technology and how technology and that language can kind of help us and sometimes hinder us. So if we go back into it's verbal communication, language and culture reflect one another, right? So if we say that means that whatever kind of culture I am in, we're going to have slang. So for me, a lot of my views and my characteristics, my desires are all tied up into theater, right? So the language that we choose to use with one another is very important and it's based on that culture. And if when I taught high school, there was a whole different language that we used. And even though some of the symbols that we talked about, some of the theories were all the way across different schools, the language that we chose, the words that we chose would be different, right? So they should reflect one another. Language and culture should do that. And then we talk about the meanings of language is subjective. That goes back to us being the people who attach the meanings to words. Yes, there are definitions for words, but it's us and how we use them and the way that we use them that really contracts the meaning of all of the words. And then it's rule governed. So there are certain rules that we follow with language. So there's certain things, real quick, this is Satine, my cat, who is in my lap. And I'm trying to pet her as long as trying to give you all the lecture. So there are certain rules that we have to follow. Some sort of syntax, semantic rules. What goes before, what verb goes before, what noun. What is a verb, what is a noun. That we all follow and that we all understand. And what happens with communication, and especially nonverbal, think about that, is that what people say and how they say it really kind of makes us determine. So go back to the perception process and that stimuli. What we choose to keep could be the way that maybe they didn't form the sentence right. Or maybe in the email, they didn't form everything right. So we then choose to keep that stimuli and base our impression off of them. So there's all sorts of different rules. There's the constructive rules, there's the communication rules, there's the regulative rules, that when and where you can talk to about certain things. Like in our class, we're not going to share everything about one another. We're going to get to know one another, but we're not going to share everything. And I think that that's really important. So those are part of those rules that we understand and that we know, right? And so then they also talk about constructive, and that's how to interpret and perform different kinds of rules for language and what we're going to do with that. Okay, this is the end of video 1, and I'll see you soon on video 2.